I was holding a glass at my own family party when my daughter laughed. "Don't let her near the guests, she smells like fish." And the room didn't stop. Still, I smiled faintly and lowered the glass, my hand calm while something cracked quietly inside me. As the ice melted and clinked, that sound kept going, reminding me how humiliation can hide behind laughter. While everyone talked over it, I realized this wasn't a joke. It was permission I'd given through years of silence. The same glass reflected my face, and that's when I understood I'd taught them I would endure anything. That's when I chose not to argue or cry. I chose to stop accepting a place that erased me. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The hum of conversation filled the Turner household as the party unfolded around Margaret, the laughter of relatives mingling with the soft clink of wine glasses. The warmth of the living room was a stark contrast to the coldness she felt, sitting in the corner with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She watched them, her family, her daughter, her son, the guests, all dancing in and out of the conversation like pieces in a game she didn't quite understand anymore. They were all so lively, so carefree, and yet she felt invisible. Her body ached, her joints sore from the years of taking care of everyone else. But the real pain wasn't in her body. It was in the quiet, relentless disappointment that had been eating away at her spirit for months now. It had all started long before this gathering. It was a kind of slow, cruel unraveling, a distance growing between her and the people who had once meant everything to her. Margaret sat back, cradling a glass of water, the ice cubes barely clinking as she took a sip. She glanced at her daughter, Hannah, who was laughing too loudly at something someone had said. Her high-pitched laughter was sharp, almost like a weapon, and Margaret's chest tightened as she watched her daughter with the same detachment that had come to define their relationship in recent years. Hannah was so polished, so perfect, so far removed from the girl who used to run to her for comfort and advice. Hannah's eyes swept across the room, and for a brief moment they landed on Margaret. There was a flicker in her gaze, something that was almost pity, but then, just as quickly, it shifted to something darker, more dismissive. Margaret felt it. That familiar sting, like a slap without a sound. Hannah smirked, just enough for Margaret to notice before turning back to her conversation, dismissing her entirely as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. Margaret's heart sank, but she didn't show it. She'd long learned how to bury her feelings, how to pretend she was fine, even when everything inside her screamed otherwise. She tried, as she had so many times before, to bridge the gap between them. She stood and made her way over to Hannah, hoping for even the smallest gesture of connection. But before she could open her mouth, her daughter's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "Don't let her near the guests," Hannah said, her tone loud and dismissive. "She smells like fish." The words hung in the air for a moment, hanging heavier than the laughter and music that had just moments ago filled the room. Time seemed to slow. The laughter faltered, just for a beat, and then there was a collective intake of breath. Margaret froze, her heart crashing into her stomach. She felt the sting of her daughter's cruelty like a slap to the face, but it wasn't just the words. It was the way the room shifted, the way every eye in the room turned, even if just for a moment in her direction. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her cheeks burned, but not from embarrassment, from something deeper, something she couldn't name. It was a humiliation so raw, so piercing, that it felt like the ground beneath her feet had given way. Her dignity, what little she had left, was shattered in an instant. Hannah, oblivious to the weight of her words, continued to laugh with the guests, as though nothing had happened, as though her mother was just another stranger in the background. Margaret's hand trembled as she gripped the glass tighter, feeling the cold against her palm. She wanted to scream, to confront her, to ask her why, after all these years of sacrifice, she was the target of such cruelty. but the words lodged themselves in her throat, unwilling to come out. Instead, she turned away, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were crumbling, but she couldn't let them see. Not here. Not now. She stepped into the hallway, her legs weak beneath her. She needed space, air, anything to escape the weight of that moment. She pressed her back against the wall, the cool surface offering little comfort. The house was spinning around her, the laughter now muffled, distant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Her mind raced, flashing back to the days when Hannah had been a child, running to her for comfort, for love. What had happened? How had it come to this? What had she done wrong? The thoughts swirled, mixing with the image of Hannah's face, cold, indifferent, cruel. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret didn't recognize her daughter. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But it was no use. She felt as though the years of sacrifice, the years of putting everyone else first, had all led to this. A life where even the love of her children seemed too much to ask for. And as the tears finally slipped from her eyes, Margaret knew one thing for certain. She couldn't live like this anymore. Margaret stood in the kitchen, the hum of the party still echoing faintly through the walls, but muffled now, as if the world had suddenly grown distant. Her hand gripped the edge of the counter, fingers pressed hard against the cool stone. She couldn't seem to breathe right. The pain from Hannah's words echoed in her chest, a dull, insistent throb that refused to let go. She smells like fish. The words repeated themselves in a cruel loop, the weight of them sinking deeper with each breath. She closed her eyes, her pulse quickening. She could hear the laughter and chatter still spilling from the living room, but it all felt far away. The festive atmosphere, the warmth of the house, it felt like it belonged to someone else. Not me. Not anymore. David appeared in the doorway, his figure framed by the light of the living room behind him. He hesitated, taking in the scene, Margaret's stiff posture, the way her eyes were unfocused, lost somewhere far beyond the room. "Mom." His voice was soft, tentative. "Are you okay?" Margaret turned slowly to face him, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. How could she explain? How could she put into words the ache in her chest, the shock of her daughter's cruelty? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. She swallowed, trying to force the lump in her throat down. "I'm fine," she said, the words feeling hollow even to her. Just a little tired. David studied her, his eyes searching hers, but he saw only what she allowed him to see. The shield she'd perfected over the years, never showing too much, never revealing the depths of her hurt. He nodded slowly, clearly uncertain, but then he stepped away, the door swinging shut behind him as he returned to the party. Margaret stood there, motionless, as the silence settled in around her. She turned back to the counter, her hand still gripping its edge. Was this really how it was going to be from now on? She thought about the years of giving herself to her family. Every sacrifice, every moment of her own desires pushed aside. For what? To be treated like this? To be humiliated in front of strangers by the one person she thought would never turn on her? Her thoughts spun back through the years to the little girl who had once clung to her, eyes full of trust and love. What had happened to that girl? Where had the bond between them gone? Margaret pressed her lips together, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. No, not here, not now. Instead, she exhaled slowly and stood a little straighter. A part of her wanted to collapse, to let the weight of everything crush her, but another part, one that had been buried for far too long, wanted to fight back. Maybe it's time to stop letting them define me. She glanced at the door to the living room. The laughter continued, oblivious to her pain. But Margaret knew, deep down, that something was shifting inside her. She wasn't going to let this moment be the end of her, not this time. With a steadying breath, she turned and walked back toward the living room, determined not to be invisible any longer. Margaret stood at the edge of the living room, just inside the doorway, watching Hannah laugh with the guests. The sound of it, sharp, unfeeling, cut through her, a constant reminder of what had just transpired. Margaret's heart still felt like it was racing, a chaotic drumbeat in her chest. She had stood in that kitchen, made the decision to face this humiliation head on. But now, as she looked at Hannah, the words she had prepared to speak seemed to vanish, swallowed by the growing realization that confronting her daughter wasn't going to bring the relief she craved. A part of her, the part that had always fought for her children, for her family, wanted to march up to Hannah, demand an apology, demand an explanation. But the thought of it felt foreign. This wasn't the way it worked anymore, and that truth, hard and bitter, settled heavily in her stomach. Hannah, oblivious to Margaret's presence, continued to hold court among the guests, her laughter ringing out with ease, as if the moment of cruelty had never even occurred. It wasn't that she had no sense of what she'd done. It was that Margaret knew, deep down, that Hannah didn't care. Not enough to apologize, not enough to change, not enough to make it right. David's figure appeared in her peripheral vision, and Margaret stiffened, her throat tightening. She was grateful for his quiet presence, but she didn't need to talk about it. Not now, not here, not when every part of her wanted to break down and scream. David's eyes met hers, concern written on his face. He hesitated, clearly aware of the tension that hung between them, but he said nothing. It wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he, too, had learned how to turn away from the discomfort of confrontation, to let the silence speak for itself. Margaret didn't blame him. He had his own battles to fight, battles that didn't have her name written on them. Margaret let out a breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't going to help. The confrontation, the yelling, the demands for respect, none of it would change anything. She had spent so many years trying to be the perfect mother, trying to be the glue that held everything together, but somewhere along the way, that had broken, too. And now, this ugly, raw moment was just another painful reminder that she had nothing left to prove, not to Hannah, not to anyone. As David drifted away, joining the party again, Margaret was left alone with her thoughts. She watched Hannah's back, her body language open, confident, as if she was in complete control of the room. The silence between them stretched, thick and oppressive. Margaret realized that confronting her daughter would only give her the power she no longer wanted to give, to demand an apology, to raise her voice, to cry out in frustration. Those would be acts of weakness, not strength. It would allow Hannah to control the narrative, to continue seeing Margaret as a figure of obligation, someone to tolerate and dismiss. No, Margaret wasn't going to allow that. She couldn't let Hannah or anyone continue to dictate how she felt about herself. Not anymore. The room felt smaller now, the laughter ringing in her ears as if mocking her decision. But Margaret stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle into her bones. Her resolve began to harden. This wasn't about her daughter. It was about reclaiming herself, finding a way to stop giving away her power, stop letting someone else define who she was. She turned away from the room, her feet moving with newfound determination. She was done waiting for validation from the people who could never give it to her. This time, she wasn't going to chase after their approval. Not anymore. As she made her way toward the hallway, the words that had been hanging in her chest found their way to the surface, but not in the way she had anticipated. She wasn't going to confront anyone. She wasn't going to beg for respect. She had already given too much of herself away. Margaret's heart, though still bruised, was beginning to heal in silence. The laughter continued behind her, but she didn't care. She was walking away from the version of herself who had begged for attention and affection. This was a new chapter, and it had begun quietly, without a single word spoken to anyone. But in the quiet, something shifted inside her, something that made her realize that maybe, just maybe, this was the first step to reclaiming the dignity she had lost. Margaret walked through the quiet suburban neighborhood, the cool evening air nipping at her skin. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed space. Space from the laughter inside her home, space from the suffocating weight of her thoughts. The streetlights cast long shadows, their soft glow barely cutting through the darkness, but it felt like a solace, a reprieve from the chaos of her emotions. With each step, Margaret's mind drifted, reflecting on the years she'd spent sacrificing herself. She'd always put everyone else first, her children, her family, their needs always ahead of hers. There had been a time when she had loved that role, the one who cared, who made sure everyone was happy, healthy. But somewhere along the way, she had disappeared. She had forgotten who she was beyond the roles she played, and now here she was, outside, alone, trying to remember. Why had I given so much? The question lingered like a cloud, heavy and thick, as her mind sifted through the countless moments she'd spent putting herself aside. When Hannah was a child, sick with a fever, Margaret had stayed up all night, comforted her, pushed her own exhaustion aside. She had done it all for them, for her children. And in return, she had been dismissed, humiliated in front of the very people she'd given everything to. The thought stung. It was sharp and bitter, but something inside her was shifting. The sadness was still there, but it was starting to feel different, like it was no longer the only emotion in the room. It wasn't a tear-filled ache that defined her anymore. She wasn't invisible, not completely. Margaret's feet carried her forward, her steps steady as she let the cold air settle in her chest, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift. I need to rebuild, she realized. I need to find myself again. The idea felt freeing, even if the road ahead seemed unclear. She thought of things she'd long forgotten. Painting, traveling, exploring what had once excited her. She didn't know how yet, but the possibilities began to stir something in her. The street curved ahead, and Margaret paused for a moment. The neighborhood stretched out before her, and she could see the glow from the windows of the homes. Their families safe inside, unaware of the transformation happening in the quiet space between her and them. She was still herself, but she was different now, stronger. Margaret wasn't going to let Hannah's cruelty define her. She wouldn't live in the shadow of her daughter's dismissal anymore. She had been invisible for too long. It was time to step into the light. Turning around, Margaret started back toward home, but her steps were different now. They were purposeful, not driven by the weight of others' expectations, but by the quiet resolve to live for herself. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but she knew it had started. It was just the beginning, and for the first time in years, she was ready for whatever came next. The door to her house stood in front of her, waiting, but it didn't feel like a trap anymore. Margaret had found her voice, and she was no longer afraid to use it. The cafe was small, the kind that felt lived in with soft lighting that turned the world outside into a hazy blur. The quiet hum of a coffee machine filled the air, the scent of fresh espresso mingling with the warmth of the space. Margaret stepped in, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on a familiar face, and she felt a strange, quiet comfort settle in her chest. Tom sat at a corner table, a coffee in front of him, looking as though he hadn't aged a day since the last time she saw him. He had always been there, through the good times and the bad, always steady, always present. They had shared so many moments over the years, and yet it had been far too long since they'd caught up. As Margaret approached, Tom stood up with a smile that was warm and genuine. His eyes, the same deep brown as she remembered, sparkled with recognition. "Margaret," he said, his voice filled with familiarity, "you look good." She smiled, a little hesitant, but grateful for the simple kindness in his voice. "Tom," she said, pulling out the chair across from him. "It's been too long." They settled into comfortable conversation, the kind that only old friends could share. Margaret felt herself relax, the weight of the evening's events beginning to lift as she sipped her coffee. Tom had always been a good listener. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He simply listened, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. For a while, they talked about life, the trivial things, the little updates about old friends, the mundane details that time had swept away. But Margaret could feel the conversation turning, just like the path of a river that slowly begins to change its course. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she admitted, staring down into her cup, "about everything, about how much I've given, how little I've received in return, and it's starting to break me." Tom leaned forward, his expression softening. "Tell me what's on your mind." Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's my daughter, Hannah. I thought I was doing everything right. I gave everything to her, to my kids. But lately, she's been so distant, so cruel. And when she made that remark at the party about me smelling like fish, it crushed me." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the clink of a spoon against a mug. Tom's gaze was unwavering, filled with empathy, and it was the first time that night Margaret felt truly seen. "You've always put everyone else first," Tom said quietly, his voice gentle. "That's who you are. But there's a difference between giving and losing yourself." Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "I don't know who I am anymore. All I've been is a mother, a caretaker. I've spent years doing for others, and now I don't even know what I need, what I want." Tom's eyes softened, a trace of sadness in them. "Margaret, you're worthy of love. You're worthy of respect, not because you're a mother or a caregiver, but because you're you." His words sank deep, settling into a place in Margaret's heart that had been neglected for years. No one had ever told her that. No one had ever reminded her that she, too, deserved something, not just because of her role, but for the woman she was. A quiet realization bloomed within her, a recognition that she had spent so much of her life living in the shadow of her responsibilities, not allowing herself the freedom to just be. The hurt, the humiliation from Hannah. It still stung, but it no longer felt like a defining moment. She was more than the sum of their expectations, more than the sacrifices she had made. Tom's words were like a lifeline, not to him, but to herself. The woman sitting across from him wasn't just a mother. She wasn't just a quiet presence. She was Margaret Turner, someone who deserved to be seen for who she truly was. Margaret blinked, clearing the sudden wetness from her eyes, a mixture of relief and vulnerability settling in her chest. "Thank you, Tom," she whispered, not knowing if she meant the words for the years of friendship or for the realization that had just dawned on her. Tom gave her a soft smile. "I always knew you had it in you, Margaret. You've always been stronger than you gave yourself credit for." For the first time in ages, Margaret felt something stir within her, something strong, something unshakable. Her path wasn't defined by her children or anyone else's expectations. It was hers to carve. The conversation shifted then, from the past to the future. But something had changed in Margaret. She felt more independent than she had in years, more whole than she could ever remember feeling. As she sat there with Tom, sharing stories and laughing at old jokes, she understood. This wasn't about finding approval from her family. It wasn't about anyone else seeing her for what she had done. It was about seeing herself truly for the first time in a long while. And that was enough. Margaret stood in the art studio, staring at the blank canvas before her. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of other artists lost in their own worlds. The smell of paint lingered in the air, familiar and comforting. It was a strange sensation. this act of doing something just for herself. She had never allowed herself such indulgence. But here she was, holding a brush, dipping it into color, letting her hand make the first stroke without thinking of anyone else's needs. The paint felt foreign at first, the brush awkward in her grip. But as she painted, she realized something she hadn't in years. She was free. The act of creating wasn't about perfection or results. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that had been buried under layers of obligations for so long. Each stroke on the canvas was a quiet rebellion against a life she had spent living for others. A few days later, Margaret met with Clara, an old friend from her past. Their conversation was easy, picking up where it had left off as though no time had passed. They shared stories, laughed, and before Margaret knew it, she was telling Clara about her new passion for painting. "I'm finally doing something for myself," Margaret admitted, her eyes lighting up. "I've wanted to do this for years. It feels right." Clara smiled warmly. "I'm so glad to hear that, Margaret. It sounds like you're finding your way back." Those words struck Margaret deeply. Finding my way back. She hadn't realized how much she had lost of herself until now. Back at home, David noticed the changes. One afternoon, he stopped by, leaning against the doorframe of the living room as Margaret set down her paintbrush. "You really getting into this painting thing?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "You're spending a lot of time on it." Margaret smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "I am. It feels good, David. I'm just doing something for me. I think it's time." David's expression softened, but the worry lingered. "Just don't forget about everything else. I don't want you to get too lost in it." Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm not getting lost. I'm finding myself again. After all these years, it's time for me to be more than just your mom, more than just a caretaker." David didn't reply immediately, but he nodded, still unsure, but slowly understanding. Margaret wasn't the same woman she had been, and she wasn't going to apologize for it. That evening, as she sat down for dinner, her phone buzzed with a message from Hannah. "Mom, we're having a family dinner tonight. Want to join us?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The pull of her old guilt was strong, but she knew this was a moment to choose herself. She stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keys. Finally, she typed, "I'll think about it." For the first time in years, Margaret wasn't rushing to please anyone. She was considering what felt right for her, and that, in itself, was the most empowering thing she had done in a long time. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the quiet of the house surrounding her. It was late in the evening, the room bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. She had just finished cleaning up after dinner, her thoughts swirling like the steam rising from her cup of tea. Her phone buzzed across the table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Hannah. "I'm sorry for what happened at the party. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was just frustrated. Please don't take it personally." Margaret's fingers hovered over the phone, the weight of the words sinking into her chest. It wasn't the first apology she had received from Hannah, but something felt different this time. The familiar knot in her stomach twisted, but there was no immediate rush to respond, no urge to reach out, to ease the tension, to make things right. It was almost as if she had become numb to the cycle of apologies and hurt. She read the message again, her eyes scanning the words with a quiet indifference. "I was just frustrated. Please don't take it personally." The words felt hollow, like they were meant to make things go back to normal, like a Band-Aid over a wound that had been reopened too many times to heal. And yet Margaret knew, deep down, that this wasn't the first time, that these words would never be enough to undo the years of hurt, the years of silently enduring. Her hand rested on the phone, but she didn't respond. She didn't feel the need to. Instead, her mind drifted back to the years of sacrifice, of constantly putting herself last, of always being the one to give, to care, to fix. There had been countless moments where she had set aside her own needs, her own desires, because her children needed her. Hannah needed her. But now, In the quiet of this moment, Margaret realized that she had been doing this for so long it had become second nature. I gave them everything, she thought, her chest tightening, and I forgot about myself. Her thoughts swirled back to the family dinners, to the birthdays she had meticulously planned, to the sleepless nights when she had been the one to care for them, no questions asked. She had given up so much, her dreams, her time, her voice, just to be there for them. But somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing her. They had stopped seeing her. She had become a role, not a person. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room as she took a slow, steadying breath. The message from Hannah, the apology, should have meant something, but instead it felt like one more thing to add to the long list of disappointments. It wasn't that she didn't care about her daughter's pain. Margaret had always tried to be there for her, but the truth was clearer now than ever before. This pattern couldn't continue. She couldn't keep accepting the disrespect, the indifference, the casual cruelty disguised as frustration. It was killing her piece by piece. Margaret looked at the phone again, the words of the apology swimming in front of her. She should say something. She should forgive, let it go, move on. But she realized with a startling clarity that forgiveness wasn't about allowing someone back in. It wasn't about opening the door for more hurt. It was about letting go. She'd been holding on to this idea, this hope, that her children would recognize all she had done for them, that they would see the sacrifices, the love. But it wasn't about what they saw anymore. It was about what she needed. Margaret placed the phone gently back on the table, her heart thudding softly in her chest. A strange calm washed over her as she stood up from the table. She walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The world outside was peaceful, the darkness broken only by the soft streetlights. But inside, Margaret felt different, lighter, stronger, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She wasn't going to answer the message. She wasn't going to chase after an apology that didn't come with understanding or change. Margaret had given enough. And now, for the first time, she was ready to choose herself. The finality of the decision settled in her bones, and as she stood there, staring into the night, Margaret knew one thing for certain. She was done. No more apologies, no more hoping. She was done waiting for them to see her. From now on, she would see herself. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her phone resting in front of her. She had been staring at it for what felt like an eternity, the message from Hannah still unread. The house was silent, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and in the stillness, Margaret felt the weight of what she had to do. It was time to face the conversation she had been avoiding. With a steadying breath, she pressed the button to call Hannah. The phone rang once, then twice, and Margaret's chest tightened. When Hannah finally answered, her voice was casual, a hint of irritation laced in the words. "Mom, what's up?" Margaret swallowed, gathering her thoughts. "Hannah, I need to talk to you about something." "Okay," Hannah replied, her voice shifting slightly. "What's going on?" Margaret took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "It's about what happened at the party. When you made that comment about me smelling like fish, it really hurt." Hannah's voice immediately became defensive. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that. I was frustrated, okay? It wasn't personal. I didn't mean to hurt you." Margaret's hand tightened around the phone, but she didn't let her emotions take over. She had spent too many years letting her feelings be overshadowed by others. This time, she wasn't going to back down. "I understand you were frustrated, but that doesn't make it okay," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "The way you spoke to me, the way you treated me in front of everyone, it hurt. I can't keep letting that go." There was a long pause, and Margaret could almost hear Hannah's thoughts turning, trying to find the right words to make this go away. When Hannah finally spoke, her tone was softer but still defensive. "I didn't mean it like that," Hannah said, her voice faltering. "But it's just, sometimes I don't know how to handle things and I snap. You know how things are. I didn't mean to upset you." Margaret took a slow breath, letting the silence settle before she spoke again. "I've spent my whole life putting everyone else's needs first, including yours. I've sacrificed so much, and I've always tried to be there for you. But I can't keep letting myself be disrespected, not even by you, Hannah." There was another long pause, and this time, Hannah didn't respond immediately. Margaret could feel her daughter's discomfort through the phone. She wasn't going to back down. "I'm not asking for your approval anymore," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not going to be treated this way again. I deserve respect, just like anyone else. And I'm setting a boundary. I won't tolerate this behavior anymore." There was a noticeable shift in the conversation. Hannah's tone softened, but the condescension still lingered. "I get it, Mom. I really do. I'll try to do better. But you know it's not always easy." Margaret's heart tightened, but she stood firm. "I'm not asking for easy, Hannah. I'm asking for real change, and that starts with you treating me with respect." The call ended with a quiet click, and Margaret sat there for a moment, her hand still holding the phone. She had said what needed to be said. For the first time, she felt the power of her own voice, unwavering and true. The weight in her chest had lifted, and though the conversation hadn't gone perfectly, Margaret knew she had finally taken control of her own story. Margaret's life had begun to shift in small but significant ways. The changes were subtle at first, picking up her paintbrush, reconnecting with friends, signing up for cooking classes. But they were enough to make her feel more herself than she had in years. Each day brought a new sense of freedom, a quiet reclaiming of the life she had put on hold for so long. The first time she noticed, it was when she stepped into the art studio and felt the weight of the brush in her hand, the colors flowing onto the canvas. She didn't have to please anyone. The painting wasn't for anyone but her, and it was the first time in a long time that she allowed herself to do something purely for the joy of it. It felt like an awakening. Then, one afternoon, Tom appeared at her door with a bouquet of flowers, his presence steady and grounding. Margaret had been spending more time with him lately, enjoying his companionship without the weight of expectation. He was the one person who had always seen her for who she was. Not just as a mother, but as a woman with her own dreams, her own life. "I thought you might like these," Tom said, handing her the flowers with a warm smile. "How's the painting coming along?" Margaret smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "It's going great. It's like I'm rediscovering parts of myself I forgot about." Tom's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to find yourself again." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was Margaret, a woman with a life beyond caregiving. The realization was freeing. The changes in Margaret's life didn't go unnoticed. David, her son, had always been a quiet presence, but lately he had started to observe her more closely. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, he paused before speaking. "Mom," he said, his voice tentative, "you seem different, happier, more confident. It's good to see you like this." Margaret smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I feel different. For the first time, I'm not putting everyone else first. I'm living for myself." David seemed to process this for a moment, his brow furrowed. "I don't know if I understand it all yet, but I'm glad you're happy." Margaret's heart softened. She knew it was hard for him to see her change, but it was a change she had to make for herself. It was time to stop living for others' expectations. As she began to make plans for a solo trip, the thought of exploring the world on her own felt both terrifying and exciting. She'd always dreamed of traveling, but the responsibilities of life had always come first. Now there were no more excuses. Margaret packed her bag, ready to leave for the coast, ready to experience life in a way she hadn't in years. It wasn't about escaping, it was about embracing her freedom, her independence, and the journey of rediscovering who she truly was. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, Margaret felt like she was finally living life on her own terms. Margaret stood at the podium, the soft murmur of the crowd filling the air around her. The spotlight warmed her face, but it wasn't the usual discomfort she had expected. There was a strange peace within her, a quiet confidence that had taken root over the past months. She had never imagined herself speaking in front of an audience, but here she was, sharing her story with a room full of women who, perhaps, needed to hear it as much as she had needed to say it. "Thank you for having me," Margaret began, her voice steady but calm. "I never thought I'd be standing here. For years, I gave everything I had, my time, my energy, my dreams, thinking that I would find fulfillment in the act of giving. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself." She paused, taking a slow breath. The room was still, hanging on her every word. She wasn't speaking for approval anymore. She wasn't speaking to be seen. She was simply speaking, sharing her truth, the one she had hidden for so long. "I spent so many years thinking my worth came from what I could do for others, especially my children. But the truth is, I had to stop waiting for someone else to see my worth. I had to see it myself. I had to let go of the idea that my love and value were defined by anyone else's approval." Margaret could feel the words resonating with the women in the room. They weren't just hearing her, they were feeling her. She wasn't just telling her story, she was showing them that it was possible to change, to reclaim what had been lost. "I learned that I could be a mother, a friend, and a woman with my own dreams, without sacrificing myself," Margaret continued. "I began to rediscover the parts of me that had been buried under years of sacrifice. I'm still on that journey, but I know now that it's mine to own." The applause that followed was soft at first, but it grew stronger as the realization of her transformation settled into the room. Margaret stood there, taking it all in, not as someone who needed validation, but as someone who had finally found the strength to stand on her own. Later that day, as she was packing up her things, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Hannah. "Can we meet? I think it's time we talked." Margaret's heart skipped. The tone was different, softer, less defensive. The message carried a sense of openness, a willingness to try. It was the first real olive branch her daughter had extended in months. Margaret smiled to herself. She wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. She had already found what she needed within herself. She typed back, "I'd like that. Let's meet." As she hit send, a sense of peace washed over her. Margaret had stepped into a new life, a life where she chose herself. Whatever happened next, she knew she was enough. The first meeting with Hannah had been a quiet, tentative step. They met at a small cafe, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, and it was just the two of them, sitting across from each other in an atmosphere thick with unspoken words. Margaret had expected tension, and at first there was some. But what surprised her was the shift she felt within herself, the ease with which she could simply be there, with no need to fill the silence with apologies or explanations. She had already done the hard work of healing. What she realized in that moment was that the healing was no longer for Hannah. It was for her, and that was enough. "Hannah, I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore," Margaret had said softly, her voice steady but clear. "What happened at the party hurt, but it's not about that anymore. It's about me choosing myself finally." Hannah had nodded, her expression unreadable. There were no grand gestures of reconciliation, no tearful confessions, but that was okay. Margaret understood that this process would take time. They didn't need to rush it. What mattered was that for the first time in years, Margaret was allowing herself to be seen, not as someone's mother, but as herself. And that was a freedom she had never known before. The days that followed were filled with quiet victories. Margaret continued her work, her talks, her writing, sharing her story with women who needed to hear it, women who were hungry for the same kind of transformation she had found. The response was overwhelming. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was giving a voice to all the women who had been silent for too long. She was empowering them to see their own worth, to step into their own lives. It was while she was on the phone with a publisher discussing her upcoming book that Margaret had her first real moment of clarity. She wasn't waiting for validation anymore. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had found her own voice, and it was powerful. This book, this journey she had embarked on, wasn't for anyone but her. As the weeks passed, Margaret noticed the change in those around her, too. Ethan and Lily, her longtime friends, had started to see the transformation in her. They were always supportive, but now there was a new kind of respect in their eyes. They no longer saw her as someone who was living in the shadows of others' expectations. They saw her as a woman who had come into her own, who had found the courage to live on her own terms. Ethan, in particular, began to reach out more, offering support, encouragement. Lily was the first to ask Margaret to speak at one of her workshops, seeing the value in Margaret's story and strength. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt truly in control of her own destiny. She wasn't dependent on anyone else for validation. She wasn't waiting for the approval of her children, her friends, or anyone else. The quiet peace that had settled in her heart was the proof she needed. She was enough. As she sat at her desk one evening, writing in her journal, Margaret began to make plans for the future. There was no rush, no pressure. She had time now, time to explore, to live in a way she never had before. She thought about traveling more, speaking to larger audiences, and writing the next chapter of her book, a chapter not just about survival, but about joy, about living freely. There were endless possibilities, and Margaret knew that she was ready for whatever came next. As she closed her journal and looked out the window, Margaret felt a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't chasing anyone's love anymore. She had it in herself all along. She had found her voice, and with it, a world of possibilities. No longer defined by her past, Margaret was ready for the future. And as the sun set, outside, casting long shadows across the room, Margaret knew that this was only the beginning. Margaret sat at her desk, the weight of the completed manuscript resting heavy in her hands. Her book, A Story of Rediscovery, was more than just words on paper. It was her life, laid bare for the world to see. It had taken months of reflection, of digging deep into the parts of herself she had long hidden, but now it was finished. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace as she hit send to the publisher. This was her story, and it had the power to help others who had been lost in their own roles, just as she once had been. Days after its release, the book garnered more attention than Margaret had ever expected. Her inbox was flooded with messages from women who shared her struggles, who had lived under the same heavy weight of expectation. She was invited to speak at events, interviewed by media, and hailed for her bravery in telling her truth. The recognition was rewarding, but what mattered most was how it felt. Margaret no longer needed anyone's approval. She had found the strength to live for herself. Then, one afternoon, as she was at home catching up on emails, the doorbell rang. Margaret's heart skipped when she saw who it was. Hannah, standing on the doorstep looking older, more vulnerable than the daughter she remembered. I was hoping we could talk, Hannah said, her voice small, tentative. Margaret stepped aside, letting her daughter in. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but there was a softness in Hannah's eyes that hadn't been there before. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Margaret waited, not knowing what to expect. "I owe you an apology, Mom," Hannah began, her voice shaky. "For everything. For how I treated you. for the things I said at the party. I was selfish and rude, and I didn't realize how much it hurt you. I'm sorry." Margaret nodded slowly. She had expected this moment, but she wasn't sure what to feel. She wasn't angry anymore. Her daughter's apology, while sincere, no longer held the power to undo what had already been done. "I hear you, Hannah," Margaret said quietly, her heart steady, "and I accept your apology. But I also want you to understand that things are different now. I'm different." Hannah's expression softened, her gaze searching Margaret's face. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm not going to live for anyone else's approval anymore. Not even yours," Margaret said, her voice firm. "I've spent my whole life trying to make everyone happy, but I can't do that anymore. I'm living for me now." Hannah seemed to process this, the weight of her mother's words settling in. "I understand," she said, though her voice held a trace of sadness. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry, and I want to try to be different." Margaret reached out, placing her hand gently on her daughter's. "You don't need to try to fix me, Hannah. I'm not broken. I'm free." Later that night, as Margaret sat alone in the quiet of her home, she realized that this conversation was the final step in her journey. She had reclaimed her life, and it wasn't about anyone else anymore. She was at peace, knowing she had done the hard work of healing, and now, for the first time, she was living for herself. Margaret's new life had unfolded slowly, like the gradual blooming of a flower after years of being buried under the weight of others' expectations. Each step she took, no matter how small, felt like an act of reclamation, a refusal to let her life be defined by anyone else but herself. She had found a rhythm in her independence, her days no longer dictated by the needs of others, but by the desires and dreams she had kept hidden for so long. The book had been a turning point, but it was the speaking engagements that truly marked her transformation. The first time she stood in front of a crowd and shared her story, she had felt a surge of empowerment. It wasn't about the applause or the praise, it was the quiet realization that her voice mattered. She no longer needed validation from anyone. She was enough. And it wasn't just her story she was sharing. It was a lifeline for every woman who had been silenced, for every person who had buried their dreams to fulfill someone else's. With each new event, Margaret's sense of self expanded. She traveled more, spoke to more audiences, and found herself in spaces where she had once been afraid to step. The world was opening up to her in ways she never imagined. The feelings of freedom, of possibility, were intoxicating. And yet she knew there was still one thing she had yet to fully do: reclaim her own space. It had been a quiet decision, but one Margaret had known she needed to make for herself. She was ready to move, to step out of the shadow of the house she had shared with her family for so many years. It wasn't just about finding a new place. It was about creating a space that reflected the woman she had become, not the one she had been. The move was both liberating and emotional. As she walked through the rooms of her new apartment, it felt different. It wasn't just the clean slate of freshly painted walls or the promise of an unfamiliar neighborhood. It was the realization that she was finally living her life on her terms, in a space that was entirely hers. There were no echoes of her past here. This was the home she had made for herself, a reflection of her newfound sense of self-love and self-expression. When Margaret unpacked her things and set up her space, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't known before. Each item she placed, her books, her paintings, her journals, felt like an affirmation of her journey. She was creating her life, not waiting for it to happen. This was her space, her time. But just when Margaret thought she had settled into her new rhythm, the doorbell rang one evening, disrupting the stillness of her home. She opened the door to find Hannah standing there, hesitant, holding a small bag in her hand. "I didn't know where else to turn," Hannah said quietly. "I've been thinking a lot, and I want to be a part of your life. I want to be part of your new journey." Margaret's heart wavered at the sight of her daughter, but there was no rush of emotion like there had been before. She felt no urgency to fix things, no need to make it right. She had spent so many years making others' needs her priority. Now it was her turn to choose. "You're welcome here, Hannah," Margaret said gently, "but this journey is mine. I've worked hard to get here, and I can't go back to what we were before. I've learned that I can't live for anyone else. I have to live for me." Hannah's face softened, the tears she had held back finally spilling over. "I understand," she whispered. "I just want to be part of your life again." Margaret nodded, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "You are, but this time it's on my terms, and I'm not asking for your approval, Hannah. I'm living for myself." In that moment, Margaret realized how far she had come. This was the final step, the one where she no longer needed anyone else to validate her. She had already found everything she needed within herself. She was no longer defined by her past, by others' expectations, or even by her relationships. She was defined by her own choices, her own voice. The world lay ahead, and for the first time in her life, Margaret was no longer afraid. She had built this life from the ground up. She had created a future that was entirely her own, and now, with a full heart and a deep sense of peace, she was ready to live it. Margaret stood in front of the full-length mirror in her new apartment, adjusting the simple but elegant dress she had chosen for the evening. She smiled at her reflection, not out of vanity, but out of pride. For the first time in a long time, she was truly seeing herself, not the woman defined by others' expectations, but Margaret, as she had always wanted to be. Her life had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each morning now felt like an opportunity, a new page in the book she was writing, and the days no longer dragged by in the shadows of old expectations. She had built this life from scratch. Every decision was hers. Every moment was her own to shape. That evening, Margaret was attending an awards ceremony for her work empowering women. It was an honor she had once dreamed of but never believed she could achieve. Now, standing at the entrance of the venue, surrounded by an air of celebration, it felt surreal. She had written her story, shared her experiences, and in return, she had been recognized not just for the work she did, but for who she had become. As she walked up to the stage to accept the award, the applause ringing in her ears, a deep sense of gratitude washed over her. Her journey was not about accolades. It was about knowing she had finally lived authentically. The award was a symbol of that, of the woman she had reclaimed and the new life she had built. "Thank you," Margaret said into the microphone, her voice steady and warm. "This journey wasn't easy, but it was worth every step. I've learned that the most important thing we can do is listen to ourselves, to honor our own needs, and to never stop believing that we are worthy of our own love. This is for every woman who has ever felt invisible, for every person who has been silenced. You are enough." The applause that followed was loud, and as Margaret stood there, feeling the warmth of their recognition, she realized it wasn't the award that mattered most. It was the truth in her words. She had reclaimed her voice, and now it echoed across the room, touching everyone it reached. As the ceremony ended, Margaret found herself alone in the quiet of her apartment. She stared out of the window at the glowing city skyline, the lights twinkling in the night like 1,000 possibilities. She had longed for freedom, for the chance to be herself, to live the life she had put aside for so many years. Now it was here, and it felt so right. Over the following months, Margaret's life took on a rhythm of its own. She began traveling the world, experiencing places and cultures she had only dreamed of before. She walked along the streets of Paris, visited the beaches of Greece, and explored the mountains of Peru. She did it all for herself. Each trip, each new adventure, was another affirmation that the world was full of opportunities waiting to be embraced. While traveling, Margaret stayed connected to her old friends, Ethan and Lily, who reached out occasionally, sending messages of support. but Margaret didn't depend on them for validation anymore. Their love and friendship were treasures, but her happiness was no longer tied to anyone else's approval. She had learned that happiness came from within. Back home, her speaking engagements continued to grow. Margaret spoke at larger conferences to more women who needed to hear her message of self-love and independence. She had no agenda other than to share her story, to show others that it was possible to live a life of freedom, to step out of the shadows and into the light of their own truth. One evening, as Margaret sat in a quiet cafe in a foreign city, sipping her coffee and reflecting on her journey, she smiled to herself. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up, the woman who had lived in fear of others' judgments, was no more. Margaret had become someone who lived boldly and unapologetically, someone who knew her worth and walked in that truth every day. And as she sat there, watching the world move around her, she knew this was her life, her story, and it was only just beginning. The auditorium was packed, the energy of the crowd a tangible hum that vibrated in the air. Margaret stood backstage, taking slow, steadying breaths. The microphone was positioned before her, its silver gleam inviting her to speak. She had shared her story countless times, but this was different. This moment wasn't just another speech. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for. Her book had changed her life, but tonight, she was here to give that transformation back to others. This was the moment when she would stand, not as the woman who had been silenced, but as the woman who had found her voice, loud, unwavering, and proud. As the MC called her name, Margaret walked onto the stage, the lights blinding at first, but she stood tall, her heart racing in a way that felt both thrilling and right. She looked out over the sea of faces, some unfamiliar, some from the countless places her journey had taken her. Each face held a different story, a different challenge, but they were all there for one reason. They wanted to hear her truth. Margaret cleared her throat, smiling warmly at the audience as she spoke into the microphone. "Thank you for being here tonight," she began, her voice resonating with the confidence that had taken years to build. "For those of you who have followed my story, you know it hasn't been easy. It took me a long time to understand that strength doesn't come from what you give to others, but from what you allow yourself to take, your own love, your own worth, your own voice." Her words were slow at first, but with each sentence, she felt the weight of her past experiences lifting, her voice growing steadier, more powerful. The silence in the room spoke volumes. It was the silence of people who were listening, people who were feeling her words deeply. "I spent so many years believing that my purpose was to fulfill the needs of others," Margaret continued. "I thought that if I gave enough, loved enough, I would find my worth. But what I realized over time was that I had lost myself in the process. I had given so much of myself that there was nothing left. The strength I needed was always inside me. It was there, buried deep, waiting for me to find it." Margaret's eyes swept over the crowd, making sure to connect with those she could see. She wasn't just telling a story anymore. She was living proof of everything she was speaking. "It wasn't until I stopped living for everyone else that I truly found myself," she said. "And I realized that being myself, unapologetically, was the most powerful thing I could do, not just for others, but for me." There was a pause in the room, a deep exhale of realization. Margaret could feel the collective breath of the audience, and it filled her with an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was what she had worked for. This was the moment she had waited for, a moment where she was not only sharing her journey, but empowering others to begin their own. Margaret's story wasn't just hers. It was for anyone who had ever been silenced, anyone who had ever felt invisible. And in this moment, she felt everything that had been a weight before now being released. As she spoke about the lessons of her journey, the sacrifices, the failures, the victories, Margaret felt herself truly accepting the legacy she was creating. Her journey had taught her about empowerment, resilience, and authenticity. She realized that her true purpose was to share this wisdom with others, to show them that no matter where they were in their journey, they had the power to reclaim their own lives. When I look back, Margaret continued, her voice firm and filled with conviction, I see a woman who was once afraid to be seen, afraid to speak up. But today, I see a woman who has learned that her voice is her greatest gift. And I'm proud to say, I found it. The room erupted in applause, but for Margaret, it was the quietest of moments. Her heart was full, not from the recognition, but from the realization that she had finally come into her own. As the applause faded and the evening came to a close, Margaret sat in the backstage room, her heart racing, her mind still swimming with the emotion of the night. She had spoken her truth. She had claimed her voice. And for the first time, she was truly proud of the woman she had become. As Margaret left the event and stepped into the cool night air, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Margaret's journey was her own, and she was no longer afraid. The world was hers to take, and she was ready to embrace it fully. With one last thought, as the city lights flickered around her, Margaret reflected on what she had written in the final pages of her book. The last line, the one she had crafted so carefully, now felt like the perfect truth. I may have been silenced for years, but in the end, I found my voice.